Greetings wherever you are. I'm delighted to have been asked to speak at ECV2020. And my presentation today will be on the Lundy Model of Child Participation. That's my model of participation, but I'm going to look at it today specifically thinking about early childhood. The title of my talk is Voice is Not Enough, the Lundy Model and Early Childhood. So my understanding of child participation comes from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. My background is in law and human rights. There are other approaches to participation, but this is the one that informs mine. And I know that many of you who are listening will be very familiar with this. This is Article 12.1 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And even if you are familiar with it, I think it's unlikely that you could repeat the exact wording of that provision. It's quite a long provision. It's a little convoluted, it's complex. And when you see that in any human rights provision, you know that it was probably contested. These provisions are negotiated by states parties, by governments, and the more contested a provision is, the more likely it is to end up longer and slightly complicated like this one. We'll come back to it. But you see that states parties have an obligation to assure to a child who's capable of forming his or her own views the right to express them freely and all matters affecting them. And then I'm taking a deliberate pause. There's then an obligation that the views of the child are given due weight in accordance with age and maturity. We know it's an incredibly significant provision. It's one of the most innovative, as I've just said. It's a general principle of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, along with 3 others. This means that it's a right in itself, but it's also considered to be an important means of understanding, applying, and realizing children's other human rights. And I've argued that it's a barometer for children's rights more generally. What we see that in any context where there is significant adherence to this obligation, where children's views are given respect, it is much more likely that their rights, other rights, the right to education, to play, or whatever, to be safe, are more likely to be protected, because we're listening to children, that idea of respect for their dignity, their worth, and also their contribution to understanding their own lives that helps us realize their rights. So it's an incredibly significant provision in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. For me, though, my journey with it goes back now 17 years when we undertook a study for our Children's Commissioner. It was the very first Children's Commissioner, and on his first day in office, he commissioned a study of children's lives in Northern Ireland, asking where their rights were ignored or underplayed. And something became really clear to me in the course of that study. I was looking at this provision, Article 12, the legal text of it, and I had an understanding of it in one way. We were talking to adults who had, when I asked them, for instance, what about Article 12 of the Convention? They would say, well, I haven't heard of that. But they would say, I would say, well, it's the provision that says that you must give children's views due weight. And they say, oh, yes, of course we do that. We do the voice of the child, or we do pupil voice, or we do student voice. Meanwhile, in the middle, we were talking to children and young people. And what became really clear from what they were saying was that their views were not being sought, or if they were sought, they were not being taken seriously, or if they were sought and not taken seriously, they were also sometimes being misinterpreted. And in particular, children were telling us across all aspects of their lives that when they were saying what they thought to many adults in different contexts, that their views were actually interpreted as being cheeky or challenging adult authority. And that in that sense, that there was a fear of expressing their views for the consequences of that. And that study, we captured some of that frustration in this particular submission from a boy in the context of family life. And you can see his mum was saying to him, you shouldn't be telling me what to do. And he was saying, I was just telling you what I think. And you can see that that was happening time and time again in different contexts. A boy not getting a say in a conversation. That got me thinking, this disconnect between what the legal obligation was, what adults were saying they were doing, and how children were actually experiencing it. And I started to think around this notion of the voice of the child and found it increasingly problematic. Also the right to be heard, the right to have a say. And I was thinking, what is the actual obligation here under Article 12 of the Convention? And I concluded that each of these types of abbreviations, and I understand why we abbreviate, because as I said at the start, Article 12.1 is a complex provision that's not easily, doesn't trip off the tongue, not easily repeated. And I concluded that each of these abbreviations was an imperfect summary that could potentially undermine implementation of the convention. What did I mean by that? I came up with a model at the time. It's published in the British Education Research Journal under the title Voice is Not Enough. And in this model, I want to emphasize that, as is the case for all human rights, that you can't understand them on their own. Human rights are indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent. And if we are to understand Article 12, we need to connect it to other significant rights in the Convention. So the model was saying, voice is not enough. And if we're to do a rights respecting approach to child participation, we need four things. We need space, we need voice, we need audience, and we need influence. And you can see in this diagram, I don't often use this original diagram, but more recently, I think I should come back to it. And I think if I came back to it, I would revise it. You can see where I'm going to talk about some of the other rights as I go through the four concepts. But if you look, for example, at Article 13, which I've classified there as the right to information. And actually, I'm doing Article 13 at that time a really strong disservice. It's not just the right to information, it's the right to freedom of expression, which includes the right to seek, receive, and impart information. And if you want something very interesting to read on that, I would send you to Sharon McLeod's paper on communication rights, where she looks at that in a much fuller way in terms of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but taking it back to its roots in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So it's all of these things are important and more, I would say now. And most recently, I have been working with my colleague, Dr. Brona Byrne, who's an expert in child participation, child rights and children with disability. And we've been looking at what a UN CRPD, Children's Rights, UN Convention Rights of Persons with Disability, what it would look like. And there again, we would add in elements that the right to express a view also includes support to ensuring that there is age and disability appropriate support for expression of a view. So what I'm going to do is briefly go through each of these four concepts and think about them in terms of younger children, who are children in the early years are defined by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child as those 8 and under. So the first part of my model is space. And what I've argued is that this needs to be actively created. We don't wait. Assure is a very strong word in a human rights treaty. So you don't wait until a child tells you something. That actually the duty bearer has to actively create a space for the child to come and express their views. This crucially needs to be a safe space. It can't be a space where the child is afraid of repercussions or reprisal, or actually just being dismissed. So we have to create the conditions where the child trusts us to express themselves. And then crucially, reading it in accordance with Article 2, which is the non-discrimination provision of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it needs to be an inclusive space. And I think that inclusive space obviously includes children who speak different languages, children with disabilities, but it also includes young children, very young children. So it's very young children and often children with learning disabilities, or doubly compounding that disadvantage, very young children with learning disabilities, I think are the most disadvantaged in terms of being included in public decision making and private decision making. So the first myth, I think, around the application of Article 12 is that it doesn't apply where children lack maturity. And one of the things that I absolutely want to emphasize and did in that first paper is the child's right to express their view is not dependent on the child's age or maturity. The concept of age and maturity applies to the weight to be given to the view, but the legal text of Article 12 says that a child who is capable of forming a view has a right to express it. Okay, so you don't shut it down because you assume that the child won't say anything sensible or mature. I put this meme up for you because it just strikes me a lot that many people will say they can't talk to children under 10 or under 8 or under 6. They pick a number. And that's not what the convention says. You can see the Committee on the Rights of the Child saying that young children obviously can make choices and communicate long before they have spoken language. And I've sometimes found it amusing that when adults are struggling sometimes, or they want to find something that expresses a very strong emotion, they turn to these little baby memes, because we know babies, for instance, are incredibly expressive and adults are using them instead of the vocabulary that adults have. The second element of my model is voice. and that is the right to express a view freely. Again, that's the language of the convention. Crucially, it's a right and not a duty. And that means that the child is entitled to give their view, but they should not be forced to give you their view. Now, the caveat to that, of course, is that we must recognise that sometimes a child not saying anything, silence, is a very powerful expression of a view. And it tells us something, and we've got to attend to that. The child must have choice in the mode of expression. Again, that can be important for all children, but especially important for young children who obviously will not want to write often, may not want to draw because not every child wants to draw. And we've got to find the ways in which the child themselves wants to be comfortable. Thirdly, as I've already said, is that it's not restricted by age or maturity. And in that, children may need or may not need help to both form and express views. And that comes down to the obligation, Article 5 of the Convention, where there's a right and a duty on adults to provide the child with guidance in the exercise of their other human rights. And I've interpreted that to say that whenever adults are seeking children's views, that we create those kind of conditions where children are able to come to build their capacity to come to a view on the issues that are affecting them. I think many of you will know, but I think it's a really striking piece of work, and that's Priscilla Alderson's study on the participation rights of premature babies, which challenges our notion of, who can be heard and who cannot be heard. And in Priscilla Alderson's study, she argued that premature babies in a neonatal unit were expressing their views, and she did that through observation when she was saying that actually it became really clear that the children were happy. Often lights were low, they were being held or touched by parents, there were no loud noises, and they were unhappy, and they expressed that, of course, through their distress, their cries, when lights were bright, when they didn't have the physical contact, or when there were loud noises. So again, she was saying that whenever they were expressing that, there was an obligation to create the conditions where the children were happier and thriving. A really important piece of work that challenged all of our notions of what it means to be capable of expressing a view. The third concept within my model is audience, and that means that the views of the child should be given due weight. But sometimes when people are repeating the model, they leave this step out, and in my mind, this is one of the most crucial steps in the model. When you look at it from a human rights perspective, there's the child as the rights holder, and then there's the decision maker, and the decision maker is, in our terms, the duty bearer, the person whose obligation it is to fulfill the right. We need to know who that is. So we need to know, firstly, it's more than just being heard, but it has to be actively listened to. We suggest that you find a dedicated listener. Who is the person who has influence over the child's life now? Or who are they? It may be more than one person. And their views should get to that or those duty bearers. That's crucial. And sometimes that might mean that we need formal channels of communication. So if you think of a school council, what is a school council if they talk and maybe there's one teacher involved, but it never makes its way to the principal or the board of governors or whichever teacher or staff member has authority to make a decision in a particular issue? It's crucial that there is an audience, a dedicated listener. I like this piece of work from Australia, creating a children's plan with children. It was, again, one of those things that was introduced to me some years back when I was thinking about early childhood. And in this, there was a very definite duty bearer. This was a report commissioned by the City of Melbourne, who were looking to involve young children in creating a children's plan. It's a really interesting piece of work. Lots of good examples of children's views being taken into account and used in planning the City of Melbourne. The one story from that I like particularly was a story about young children taking a walking tour of the city, which many of you will use or be familiar with, and explaining that they find the traffic lights, the crossings, the zebra crossings, stressful because the beep would start to go and it was going very fast before they'd managed to cross the road. Being really clear that there wasn't enough time for their little legs to make it, and actually to encourage the crossings to have extra time, which not only benefits young children, of course, but benefits anyone else that might have mobility issues crossing a road. Influence is the final step of the model, and in some ways this is the holy grail of child participation, that children's views should be given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. So this is the point where age and maturity come in, not expression of views, but in the weight given to the child's views. And again, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has emphasised that this should not be interpreted as an endorsement of authoritarian practices which restrict children's autonomy and self-expression, that, you know, that speak to children's incompetence. We don't just take their views and go, oh, well, we can't really do that, can we? They don't get it. You know, that this is crucially important, that we're trying our positive statement be a presumption of doing what children want in terms of affecting their own lives, and then only not doing it where, in a sense, it is not possible, or what they've seen is not within that range of experience, and then other factors come in. But if that is the case, and it's not possible to do what a child or children are asking for, it's crucial in all cases that they are given feedback about the extent of influence they have had. We must ensure that there is a formal response to children. We don't do smash and grabs where we come in and we take a child's views and then we never return to tell them what we did with it. So back in 2007, I was arguing that we needed to make meaningful engagement a meaningful term, and I settled, as everyone does, on feedback. And I said we should make it uncomfortable for adults to solicit children's views and then ignore them. And over time, I and others have tried various ways of engaging duty bearers at the start, getting them to make videos, getting them to make public commitments, meeting children and young people. These are all effective strategies in terms of building the relationship that might mean that we get into a meaningful dialogue and bring about change. But more recently, I've been thinking a lot about the quality of the feedback that children get. And I've been suggesting that we need a duty bearer audit, and that whenever any adult takes a child's views, that they should respond to the child in more detail than, thank you very much for your views. Your views are very important to us. We will take them into account. And these are some questions that I think that any duty bearer, whether that is you as a policymaker or you're a practitioner or you're a researcher like I am, that you should be saying to you, asking yourself these questions. What did you agree with in terms of what the children asked or suggested? What, if anything, surprised you? Why did that surprise you? Did you disagree with anything? If so, what did you disagree with? Why did you disagree with? What else do you know? Has it influenced your views in any way? If so, how? What have you decided? And what is happening next, and when will it happen? And I think if children give us their views and take the time to do it, I think there is an onus on us to respond in detail. This, to me, is a critical and crucial juncture in the participatory relationship. It must be a dialogue. And the more that we engage with that and the better the quality of the feedback, I think the more likely it is that children's views will be given due weight. So the model, just to say briefly, its appeal is that I suggest in 2007, I wanted to produce something that was legally signed and user-friendly. I think I managed to do it. It's intended to capture the qualities of rights-based participation rather than different forms or levels. I'm not interested in so much, in terms of hierarchical ladders of participation, where it sits. From a rights-based perspective, a child-led decision could be a decision that it reaches a child's right, okay? We always want to have as much participation as possible, but higher is not always or necessarily better. Thirdly, the concepts are fluid and flexible and can apply to any form of participation or for all children, including very young children. And what we find is that children grasp the concepts readily. Many people have taken it on board, too many to list, but the one that I'm very proud of is Ireland's National Child and Youth Participation Strategy, which is a really innovative strategy across all government departments with all children. And I worked with policymakers there to provide a checklist of participation. So not just the 4 concepts, but actually questions that policymakers and practitioners could ask themselves. They could have yes and no answers. We're currently working with the Irish government on a new national framework for child participation that is changing this checklist, and we're starting to ask much more probing questions, I think, qualitative questions. So it's not have children's views been actively sought, it's how have children's views been actively sought, and that will be released very soon. So really, to sum up, I want to say to you that there is no one right way to ensure compliance with Article 12. I argue that you should have space, voice, audience, and influence, but the actual method that you choose is inevitably child, decision, and context dependent. So what will work for a younger child in one context might not work in another context. So what might work in education might not work in health, might not work in speech and language. It's all dependent on the context of the child and the actual decision, and you have to choose what is appropriate and right. And one of the most crucial ways that you can do that is, of course, to ask children themselves. So thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing some questions from you and feedback on that, and to listening to the other presentations in the conference. Thank you.